Philip II by William Thomas Walsh. Chapter 7. Philip looks towards England. 1553. Philip was now King of Spain, in fact, if not in name. He brought with him a letter from Charles to the Cortes, stating that His Imperial Majesty, unable though desirous to undertake so long and costly a journey to visit his beloved people, had decided to send in his place the most serene Prince Don Felipe, whose great virtue, lofty character, and praiseworthy habits, together with his love for those realms, had caused the Emperor to vest him with absolute power and royal majesty, as king and natural lord, recognizing no superior in temporal affairs. Not even Charles himself? This was the implication. No doubt the Emperor felt that he was taking no risk with one so devoted and obedient. In his correspondence with Philip from 1551 to 1553, he usually made his suggestions, and added that the regent would of course make his own decision. In his letters to his sister Mary, one occasionally finds, "We have instructed our son." When money was the subject of discussion, as only too often it was, the imperial tone became more obvious. Philip began to rule, as Letty remarks, with a caution that did credit to his 24 years. He freely consulted Alba and other ministers, and if still in doubt, sent to Germany for the emperor's opinion. A year or two later, however, when his father had been plunged by a revolution of the wheel of fortune from the glory of Mühlberg to the armchair of a sick, defeated, and world-wearied old man, the prince stood definitely on his own feet. "My father needs help more than being bothered," he would say. "Let us attend to the business ourselves, with God's help and our own good will." The fragmentary accounts of his early 20s lend little support to the northern legend of a morose and gloomy introvert, spinning his webs in the dark. On the contrary, he seems to have been a pretty normal young man, who knew enough not to talk too much, especially to those who wished to use him, devoted himself with intense earnestness to the business committed to him, and managed at the same time to enjoy life with a great deal of energy and gusto. The solitary ghoul of Protestant tradition managed to derive an extraordinary amount of pleasure at this period from music, painting, dancing, and the society of women. He was beginning to assemble a chapel soon to be known as the best in Europe. His generosity to his singers and composers was proverbial. Palestrina, Cabezon, Guerrero, Flecha, Pizarro, Castillo, the list of the great musicians he helped is long. Modern music owes him something, surely, for his patronage of Vittoria. He was even more a patron of art. Painters could get money from him when he was on the verge of bankruptcy. His attitude to them, almost invariably, was more of friendship than of condescension. The reserve which courtiers and politicians found impenetrable was never noticeable to such men as Titian, Sancho Coelho, or Antonio Moro. This last, who looked more like a great noble than an artist, this Moro, with the clothes and manner of a courtier, had been the protégé of the younger Granvelle, the painter of the Bishop of Arras, when Philip had met him in Brussels in 1549. Perhaps it was his dwarfs and buffoons, perhaps his study of Granvelle's dwarf Pegeron, that first commended him to the prince. More likely it was the penetrating fidelity of his characterizations. At any rate, Moro would have been brought to Spain in 1551 if the prince had had his way. But the great artist had a commission to execute in Rome, and another afterwards in Portugal for Queen Mary of Hungary. Later he visited Philip several times at Madrid, went to the Netherlands to paint some portraits for him, and returned to Castile to do that full length of his patron, which is still in the Escorial. And Titian, Philip's admiration for his father's venerable protégé, who had painted him when he was a boy, was unbounded, and he still wrote to the great man with a sort of childish exuberance. Acutely disappointed because Titian, then in Venice, had been unable to visit him in the Netherlands, he had written to the imperial ambassador at Venice from Augsburg. When Don Juan Hurtado de Mendoza replied that Titian would leave as soon as the dog days were over and the August rains had fallen, Philip replied, "I should be very glad if he came as soon as possible. So I charge you and I pray you that if he has not already left when you receive this, you should hasten his departure by telling him how great a service he will do me and how much pleasure I shall receive by his coming." Titian never made the long journey. 2 years later he sent Philip 2 pictures in care of the Bishop of Segovia. "They are like all the works of your hand," wrote the prince gratefully at the end of 1552, "and you have given us great pleasure by sending them. The one you spoke of as a picture of a Persian queen has not arrived. Send us information as to whom you entrusted it to, and if there is anything in which we may show you favour and grace, be assured that you have our entire goodwill. Don Juan de Benavid will say to you what I shall refrain from setting down here. Even after Philip's death, when old artists no longer had anything to hope from him, they recalled the simplicity and lack of condescension with which he dealt with them, and the warmth of his friendship for some of them. In 1600, for example, Gaspar Gutierre de los Rios wrote of his mucha humanidad y suavidad with men of the brush and the chisel, and added with fervent Latin hyperbole that if one could collect all his infinite favours to them, one would be drowned in the deep gulf they would make. In the autumn of 1551, Philip and a gay company of cavaliers escorted his sister, Joanna, then 16 years old, to the Portuguese border, there to deliver her to another cortege with waving plumes and cloth of gold, who conducted her to Lisbon to marry the second son and now the heir of King John III. She was the favourite sister of Philip, rarely beautiful, discreet and virtuous, wrote Cabrera. Her going at this time was a great loss. Philip was thinking that it was high time he himself married again. His only son, deformed and delicate and slow of development, was not a person on whom to pin all hopes of the Spanish, perhaps the imperial, succession. There was some vague talk of his marrying his cousin, Mary Tudor. Charles was incensed by her treatment at the hands of the upstarts who controlled the young Edward VI. He had hardly lifted a finger for her when she was believed to be in daily danger of death by poisoning, but now it suited his diplomatic purposes to consider drawing a chivalrous sword on her behalf. His sister Mary wrote the Bishop of Arras an astonishing letter, October 5, 1551, proposing that the Emperor launch a great armada against the shores of England. The seizure of an English port, which would dominate the Netherlands, she said, was one of her chastellux en Espagne. Division and poverty would make England easy to conquer. Young Edward could be released from his evil counsellors, and his sister Mary could be married in the imperial house. It would mean war with France, but that would be inevitable sooner or later in any case. The war must be short, however, for a longer one would be too expensive. This seems to be the first hint of an attempt by a Spanish armada to conquer England. Whether she had Philip in mind as a possible husband for Mary is doubtful, but Philip had fairly definite ideas of his own on the subject, and they seem to have turned again towards Portugal. He considered seriously marrying his Aunt Maria, sister of John III, and aunt also of his own dead wife. In 1551 he sent his friend Roy Gomez to Portugal to open negotiations. The sequel indicates that his interest this time was hardly a sentimental one. Philip's private life has been a subject of warm controversy. It would be just as rash, perhaps, to accept the judgment of Major Hume that as far as women were concerned he was an angel in comparison with most of the contemporary monarchs, including his father, as it would to set him down as an inconscionable libertine on the testimony of his two bitterest enemies, William of Orange and Antonio Perez, both of whom had good personal reasons to infer that all men were fornicators, and even better reasons for wishing to blacken the benefactor against whom they had turned. Curiously enough, it is your modern left-wing publicist, 9 times out of 10 preaching a sentimental tolerance for free love, who professes to be most shocked and scandalised by Philip's amorous adventures. Much has been made of the reports of the Venetian ambassadors, his father's enemies, that he was of a sensual and passionate nature and loved women. This was probably true. It is not necessarily to his discredit, and there is abundant evidence of his self-control. To be a crown prince of considerable personal attractions, and to have beautiful women constantly throwing themselves at his feet, to live in an age that condoned what was virtually a form of polygamy, so numerous and so esteemed were the bastards of great men, to have before him the pagan examples of his great-grandfather Ferdinand the Catholic, or his grandfather Philip the Handsome, and of his own father, finally, to have been married by the barbarous royal custom of the time at 16, and left a widower at 18, with the sex instinct fully aroused in him. Here was a set of circumstances little conducive to chastity, even with the best intentions in the world. No one with any knowledge of human nature would expect that Philip came through unscathed, yet the grace of God makes all things possible, and some Spanish apologists have attempted complete exoneration. What is the evidence? Gregorio Leti appears to be the chief accuser of Philip for the period in question. He declares categorically that after the death of his first wife, Philip loved Donna Catherine Lenez, daughter of one of his secretaries, with extraordinary passion, but gave her in marriage in 1553 to Antonio de Cazores, who took her to Naples. Even Leti offers no proof that there was anything here more culpable than in Philip's romantic attachment for the Duchess of Lorraine, of which Granvelle dropped a hint in 1550. The prince's connection with Donna Isabel Osorio, sister of the Marquess of Astorga, is equally obscure. He was said, on no trustworthy evidence, to have had several children by her. 30 years later, in 1581, William of Orange declared in his bitter apology that Philip had married her secretly even before his marriage with Maria of Portugal. Major Hume had pointed out the absurdity of the accusation that a boy as obedient as Philip would have dared, before he was 16, to marry without the emperor's consent. On the face of it, it seems unlikely that even so prudent a youth as Philip could have concealed many such amours from so many prying eyes for decades, or that if he had all those illegitimate children assigned to him by his enemies, there should have been no other contemporary references to them of a trustworthy character, especially in an age that took so casual a view of such matters. There is much to be said for the verdict of "not proven," in which Ballesteros and other Spanish historians concur. Human nature is inconsistent enough to allow us to suppose that in Philip's personality at this time there met two powerful impulses of the period: the pagan aspiration of Renaissance men for liberation of the flesh and its passions from the restrictions imposed upon it by Christ and his church, and a counter-influx of sanctity which forced the mind to admit Christ's truth, even when it shirked the consequences of this avowal. The madness of lust and selfishness that assailed all Christendom, and Italy especially, is notorious enough. The eternal sanity that reasserted itself in the most astonishing array of brilliant saints in all history is less often noted. Both these forces existed side by side in society as they do today. In the Cinquecento, they united in single men to form an apparent equilibrium difficult for the modern man to understand. If a 20th century artist committed the crimes unblushingly acknowledged by Benvenuto Cellini, we should be greatly astonished to find him retiring to a monastery for 3 days of prayer before commencing a major work, but no one thought of calling Cellini a hypocrite. Lust was not the only means, or the most subtle, by which a man and a king could be corrupted. Philip had little vanity, but considerable pride, which is worse. Once he had made up his mind, it was almost impossible for him to retreat and acknowledge himself beaten. He could forgive injuries, and often did, but there were unchristian limits to this forgiveness. For example, like many who trust too much, he could never sufficiently punish a man who had betrayed his confidence. He had imbibed, almost with his mother's milk, a sense of the importance of the King of Spain in the general scheme of things, especially when the king was emperor. The peace and happiness of a whole people, perhaps of a whole world, depended upon him. More than that, where would the Church of Christ be without the strong sword of the kings of Spain to defend her? Had any other monarchs ever shown such outright and consistent devotion to the Holy See? English kings might fall away, French kings might ply their treachery, but there was one king in the world on whom the Vicar of Christ might always depend. Thus, into the pride of race, the pride of a splendid monarchy, the pride of a new nation, all perhaps inevitable and to a certain extent necessary and good, entered the more subtle and deadly virus of a spiritual pride. What a good Christian the King of Spain was! Even God looked to him for help in his vast regiment of the world. This temptation which came to Philip with power was so subtle that his love of God and his love of himself must have been inextricably entangled, even more than in most individuals. The vine of self-interest had begun to wind itself so cunningly about his piety that, if it did not choke the flower, it might never be possible to distinguish between the two. The very title, the Catholic King, which he would soon inherit from his father, was almost a contradiction in terms. Caesar and God, Christ and the world, power and love, pride and humility, the lion and the lamb lying under the same bush, oil and water, combined in one poor, lonely, human entity. The resolution of this discord might happily be accomplished in the person of a Saint Edward, a Saint Louis, a Saint Ferdinand, a Saint Henry, but not in a well-meaning, sensual Charles V, seeking by force and compromise to realise the uncompromising peace of the city of God. Philip still hankered strongly to be emperor, in spite of all his rebuffs in Germany. There were good reasons to believe that this would be the best thing for the Church and for Christendom, that nothing else could stay the rapid spread of Protestantism in the north. It was also pleasant for a man of 25 to contemplate the glorious image of himself ruling over so large a portion of the world, impressing his ego upon the course of history, undoing all the blunders and misfortunes of his fathers. When he sent his Aunt Mary a request for some German troops at the beginning of 1552, he apparently asked that the negotiation for his election be kept alive. The regent passed the information on to Charles. The emperor replied, February 24th, that, as for sending the Germans, I am sure that if he were here he would be able to answer himself, for the spectacle of our want of money would make clear the impossibility of satisfying his demands. You will find it easy to reply to him, giving him these reasons, so that he may do his best to get together a good sum of money, for you well understand that unless he does so he will have all he can do to hold his own, which is quite a different matter from being able to take the offensive. The present state of Germany is eloquent enough in answer to the second point, namely the campaign for his election, and shows how far we are at present from being able even to think of it. Indeed, I fear that the fact we were once put it forward has proved a weapon in the hands of the ill-disposed and aided them to further their schemes. Charles had gone to Innsbruck on November 2nd, 1551, partly to be near the Council of Trent, which seemed likely to accomplish something in spite of the lack of French participation. In February 1552, the council was at a deadlock. War completed the wreckage of its hopes and once more delayed the reform of the Church. At the same time, it played havoc with the ambitions of Prince Philip. His request for German troops was probably part of a very bold plan, whereby he evidently meant to rid Christendom of great menace and to win such prestige that his election as emperor would be inevitable. Almost immediately after his return from the Netherlands, he began assembling a fleet for an offensive on the Mohammedan pirate nest in Algiers. The withdrawal of Doria's fleet to bring him back to Spain and conduct Maximilian back to Germany had given the Turks a chance to break their truce with Charles and seize Tripoli, one of the two vital Christian bases in the Mediterranean. The loss to Spain and Christendom was serious, yet there was short-sighted rejoicing in Germany and in France. Indeed, the French ambassador, Aramon, was with the Moslems at Tripoli and urging them to strike another blow in western waters. Both the Lutherans and King Henry II, a more subtle enemy of Charles than his father Francis I had been, were waiting to catch the emperor at a disadvantage. The Lutheran preachers prepared for the onslaught by laying down a barrage of foully abusive pamphlets and vilifying sermons. The Lutheran princes were carefully preparing. At the right moment they were joined by the King of France. While the French started the conflict in a small way in northern Italy, it burst furiously into Germany. Maurice of Saxony, whom Charles had virtually made, turned on him and joined his fellow Protestants. Charles found himself alone, betrayed and weak in the midst of his enemies. He suspected even his brother Ferdinand, though perhaps unjustly, of conniving with his foes. Even his daughter Maria, Maximilian's wife, seems to have turned against him. She seized this unlucky moment, when he was assailed on all sides and desperately in need of money, to press him for payment of her dowry. The young woman undoubtedly was under her husband's thumb. Maximilian, at least, was secretly on the side of the enemy. There were fears in Spain that the work of perversion begun by her Jewish confessor years before was almost complete, and that she was on the point of giving up the faith. The correspondence of Charles in 1553 reveals the anxiety he felt about her confession. "I have written her to do as she pleased," replied Philip. In 1552, Charles was beset on every side. It was the most calamitous year of his life. In May, he barely escaped capture by the traitorous Maurice of Saxony. The world was astonished to hear of the Holy Roman Emperor fleeing from Innsbruck in the night and being borne over the Alps in a litter, sick, old, and defeated. Philip's loyalty to his father never wavered. He gave up his naval plans on the Mediterranean. He helped his father with money and troops that he could have used to better advantage at home. Mary of Hungary thought he ought to go to Italy to attack the French in Piedmont, but the emperor vetoed that suggestion. Philip would have no money, and it would be a disgrace to see the kind of life the imperial ministers had to live. His going would do no good, continued Charles. In fact, it would make matters worse. Everyone would ask him for money, and he would have none to give. Furthermore, without his presence, the Cortes of the three kingdoms of Aragon, Catalonia, and Valencia could not meet at Monzon, and the emperor depended upon them for a subsidy to pay for a loan Mary had taken up on exchange at Antwerp. Those Cortes are of such a disposition, he added, that it will be impossible to get them to do their work in less than 4 months, though all were to be lost for it. All that year Philip was pestered with appeals for money from Charles, Mary, and the imperial ministers. In April, Charles wrote his sister that he had instructed his son to let 300,000 or 400,000 ducats in gold or otherwise be taken from Spain to Flanders. No more money was to be had from Fugger. Fugger had none himself, as he said, but would furnish his credit. Matters went from bad to worse after the flight from Innsbruck in May. By December, the situation was almost desperate. After a brief triumph at Augsburg, Charles had undertaken the siege of Metz, pitting Alba against the Duke of Guise and the French army. Mary rushed gold to him by post and silver in wagons. She wrote that it was all she could scrape up. I am amazed myself at the quantity I got, after my pockets have been cleaned so often. Money must be sent from Spain at once. Merchants in Spain fear the prince will not pay out the money for the 600,000 ducats I took up on exchange, though I trust your majesty's assurance. If he does not pay, it would mean the utter ruin of your affairs here and in Spain, and I, my lord, would be at my wit's end. She urged that Philip hurry to the Netherlands to save his reputation, which was being depreciated by the systematic slander and misrepresentation of his enemies. Time after time, Philip scraped up the enormous sums demanded of him. He had changed his capital from Valladolid to Madrid in 1551. The reason is not clear. He presided at the Cortes of Castile, obtained a good subsidy, the chief interest that Charles had in the matter, and what was more to his own credit, had some excellent laws passed. At least so they appeared to him and to the Cortes. One of them forbade the export of wool. There was a great demand for Spanish wool abroad, and this raised the prices at home. Philip and his Cortes would have considered the modern economist's attempt to promote prosperity by deliberately raising prices a little insane, if not positively wicked. They took it for granted that low prices were a good thing. The same Cortes forbade the export of manufactured articles to the colonies on the ground that it raised prices in Spain, whereby we who work here cannot live. Another of Philip's sumptuary laws attempted to diminish the use of luxuries, of which the hidalgos were altogether too fond. As the Jews and Marranos were the chief dealers in these, it was to their interest to have higher prices, thus conflicting with the policy of the kings and the people. Modern economists have generally blamed Philip for favouring the consumer rather than the producer, on the ground that this tendency caused in the end stagnation of trade, unemployment, and loss of wealth and markets. The problem is not quite so simple, however, as it appears to these theorists. One unusual factor in the situation was the huge decrease in the population of Spain from 1500 to 1550. In some parts of the country it amounted to 50%, and this in a virile and fecund race with a high birth rate. The reason, of course, was the colonisation of the New World, which had proceeded on a gigantic scale during the lifetime of Charles. Not until 1591 did the population return to the level of 1491, the year before Columbus sailed. After the Cortes of Castile, Philip rode to Aragon, where, as his father had anticipated, he had to argue for months with the delegates at Monzon. He was still there October 28th, with the Cortes at a deadlock. In the end, he obtained the money that Charles desired and returned to Castile. Ruling the richest country in Europe, with the gold from the Indies pouring into Seville, he found himself almost bankrupt. The wars of Charles had drained the peninsula and nearly ruined the empire and the Spanish crown. Towards the end of 1552, Philip wrote his father a protest against this suicidal policy. The emperor, from his camp before Metz on Christmas Day, sent a defensive letter in which he admitted, "We are spending very large sums here, and little can be done to help us in Spain, because all the ordinary sources of revenues are exhausted, down to the end of 1554 and for part of 1555, while we remain without funds for current expenses in Spain for this and the coming years. We did everything that was in our power to avoid this present war, but the King of France and the German rebels forced our hand." As the 500,000 ducats Philip had paid for Mary's debt on exchange had been insufficient to pay wages due, we have been forced to take up a further sum at exchange in Flanders, assigning payment in Spain, as you will have heard from Queen Mary, my sister, and from a private letter I wrote you on the 11th instant. We beg you affectionately to see that the merchants are paid, for which purpose the gold and silver from Peru must serve. Philip must also allow 625,000 ducats to be sent from Spain. The emperor promised to disband the army as soon as possible. "There is nothing in this world," he added, "that gives us greater pain than to overburden our Spanish kingdoms, and one of our main objects is to establish our policy on a firm basis enough to enable us to afford them some relief." Dutiful Philip obeyed as usual, and commandeered the gold arriving at Seville, most of it consigned to private individuals. The worst of it was that after all his sacrifices, after he had begun his rule by aiding his father to perpetuate that vicious system by which his country was to be systematically drained of its new wealth for the enrichment in the end of international bankers, after all this, Charles was obliged to give up the siege of Metz. Alba was beaten by that other good Catholic, the Duke of Guise. The Lutherans, the French, and the Turks were overjoyed. The crisis came in 1553. Charles was ruined, the empire little more than a name, and Philip's chances of being emperor hardly worth discussing. He accepted the blow without complaint. After all, he would still inherit the Low Countries, then at the height of their wealth and prosperity, and could count upon using them as a buffer against France, England, and, if need be, his cousin Maximilian. At this point, it does not seem to have occurred to Philip that, without the empire, it would require almost superhuman powers to hold the Netherlands. But the astute organisers of some of the northern Protestant intrigues were well aware of it. They were using all means, therefore, to discredit him in Flanders. Their propagandists were saying openly that Charles had not long to live, and that it would be a calamity if Philip succeeded him as ruler of the Low Countries, especially as Maximilian was his superior in every way, as a linguist, as an affable man, as a masterly statesman. It was whispered more quietly that Maximilian had an understanding with the German Lutheran princes, and no doubt would turn Protestant after the death of Charles and Ferdinand. Thus all northern Europe would become Protestant. Mary, more loyal to her family than to the Church, saw the danger and warned Charles, December 1552, to send his son to the Netherlands with all possible haste. The longer he delayed, she said, the greater would be Philip's loss of reputation. She repeated this advice to the prince himself early in 1553. If he wished to make sure of inheriting the Netherlands, she said, he had better get there by September. The emperor wrote in similar vein, and shortly after his letter came Francisco Duarte with a personal message from members of the Emperor's Council in Flanders, a message of warning too important to be committed to writing. The prince, said Duarte, should lose no time in getting to Flanders, and should take with him a large sum of money. All this was discouraging under the circumstances. What Duarte reported about the emperor was even worse. Charles's physicians feared he could not survive another winter in the north. Besides the torments of the gout, which crippled him hand and foot, he had sunk into that lethargic melancholy that had been the curse of one branch of his family. The mother of the great Isabel had succumbed to it. Isabel herself had almost fallen prey to it at one time. Everyone knew the story of Joana la Loca. Charles was now a victim of this insidious malady. He seemed incapable of action, abhorred all business, would listen to no one but his Spanish secretary, Francesco de Arasso, and to him only on the gravest military matters. Foreign ambassadors waited many days for an audience with him, and then were suffered to remain in his presence only the length of a credo. So little was the emperor seen, in fact, that many said he was dead. Tongues were already buzzing with the merits of Maximilian and the limitations, real or imaginary, of Prince Philip. Meanwhile, the emperor hardly ever slept. In his less supine moments, he was diverting himself day and night by taking all his clocks to pieces and putting them together again. He was trying to make them all keep the same time. It was almost a symbol of that world of time that was slipping away from him so fast, that complex world whose elements had seemed to lie in his imperial hand a few years ago, waiting to be harmonized and adjusted. Charles began to see himself drawn into timeless eternity, and leaving behind him more voices than ever, harsh, unreconciled, bewildering, to proclaim, each in its own forsaken tempo, the folly of kings and the incurable futility of a world of clocks. Things were in this state when Philip moved his capital back to Valladolid early in the summer. Money, money. They all asked him for money and more money. How could he go to the Netherlands without money? What would be the end of all this expense, this warfare, this constant intrigue? It would be a comfort if he could choose to be King of Spain only, and let the rest of the world go hang. But he could not leave his father in the lurch, nor could he abandon Christendom to its enemies. What could be done without money? At this dark moment there came a letter by Imperial Courier that changed everything. History had been in the making in England. A door of opportunity had opened for Philip and for Spain. Sickly young King Edward VI was dead. Poisoned, wrote Vargas to Philip on July 27th. The resulting situation presented so favourable an aspect to Charles that it caused a marvellous change overnight in his health and spirits. On July 30th, he wrote the Prince of the idea that had come to him. The Northumberland rebellion against Mary Tudor had been crushed. God had given the victory to the Catholic side. A way was now open of compensating Philip for the loss of the empire. It had been suggested, wrote Charles from Brussels, that he himself take Mary Tudor for his wife. The English disliked the idea of a foreign match. If their prejudice could be overcome, they would more readily support me than any other, for they have always shown a liking for me. He had no desire, however, to add to his estates, but, as it is well to consider all things, it has occurred to me that, if they were to make a proposal to me, we might delay in such a manner as to suggest to their minds the possibility of approaching you. The advantages of this course are so obvious that it is unnecessary to go into them, and we need only consider that negotiations have already been opened with the Infanta Donna Maria. The Emperor suggested that Philip consider the matter and make up his mind. It would be well to write Ruy Gomez in Portugal as to whether he had committed Philip to the Portuguese princess. Faithful Ruy Gomez! Without knowing anything of this, he was already posting back from Lisbon. The news he brought seemed providential. Let Philip tell the story to his father in his own words. Imagine him, lean and self-contained, dignified even when alone, dressed with great care in a rich but plain, dark costume set off by a simple gold chain at the neck, making his blonde hair and beard look lighter by contrast. He sits at a great carved desk, very old and cunningly inlaid, with a piece of parchment before him, some long quills at one side, and a small box of sand to dry the ink. Perhaps he knits his fine brows thoughtfully a moment, and then begins to write, in his nervous but determined hand, a revealing letter. If his words unintentionally reflect something of that huckster mentality which debased the royal matrimonial negotiations of the period, it also clears him of the charge that he jilted the second Maria of Portugal. I will first kiss your Majesty's hand for what you say to me, he wrote, for I very well see the advantages that might accrue from the successful conclusion of this affair. Your letter arrived at just the right moment, for I had decided to break off the Portuguese business in view of the reply brought back to Ruy Gomez to the effect that the king could not possibly give his sister more than the 400,000 ducats of her dowry, and from that sum would have to be deducted the 80,000 ducats still owing to my sister for her dowry, and also the 2 large properties your Majesty gave her in those kingdoms, and the Infanta would bring about 45,000 ducats in jewels, silver and gold, the rest to be paid within 1 year, and I calculated that we might be sure of obtaining that sum fairly soon by the means that were suggested. But when I read your Majesty's letter, I thought I had better keep the negotiations alive by answering that, as the king could do no more for his sister, and as your Majesty has been led by what the king had said to the most Christian queen to believe that he would be more liberal, I thought I had better inform you, as you will learn at greater length from Don Inigo de Mendoza. All I have left to say about the English affair is that I am rejoiced to hear that my aunt has come to the throne of the kingdom, as well out of natural feeling as because of the advantages mentioned by your Majesty, where France and the Low Countries are concerned. If Mary suggested a match with the Emperor and Charles was willing, it would be, continued Philip, the best thing possible. But as your Majesty feels as you say about the question, and if you wish to arrange the match for me, you know that I am so obedient a son that I have no will other than yours, especially in a matter of such high import. Therefore I think it best to leave it all to your Majesty to dispose of as shall seem most fitting. I am well, and my son, the Infante also, thanks be to God. My sister, the Princess, is with child. About the time Philip penned these lines, he signed his name to another paper establishing the first university in the New World, the one at Mexico City. His horizon, which had appeared to be closing in upon him like a doom, had suddenly expanded again to include in its possibilities nearly all the world. The more one thought of this English business, the fairer seemed the prospect. To the Catholic heart of Philip, it must have appeared as if an instrument of infinite good had been placed unexpectedly within his reach. He could see himself in imagination ruling by Mary's side as king, hailed by the Catholic majority of Englishmen as saviour of their country, and winning over or suppressing the little handful of upstarts who, for their own enrichment, had violently torn the country from the Catholic unity. Mary was 12 years older than he, to be sure. She was then 38, but still of childbearing age. If she had a son, and why not, any lingering resentment of the English against a Spanish ruler would be forgotten in proud loyalty to a half-English heir and to his father. After all, Philip himself had English blood in him, deriving on both sides from the House of Lancaster. England would be part of the Spanish, if not of the German, Empire. France, the disturber of Christian peace, ever since she had become a despotism under Louis XI, would be isolated and encircled by Spanish possessions, and either absorbed by another felicitous Habsburg marriage, or at least reduced to comparative impotence. Merely to bring back one nation to the Church of Christ would be glorious enough, but to have power to keep all Europe in the Catholic fold, to expedite the reform of the Church, to make good and salutary laws for all men, to defeat the Turk with the united powers of Christian Europe, it was something like a millennium that rose and glittered before the mind of Philip. It is no wonder that he grasped eagerly at the vision. What need he care now for the moribund German Empire? Let Maximilian have it, and be overshadowed by Don Felipe, King of Spain, England, Naples, Milan, and the Netherlands, King of North and South America, most of them at any rate, and of God knows how much of Asia. It must be admitted, and it has been admitted by all impartial students of this man's life, that he always thought of power in terms of service to God. Coolly, and without the slightest manifestation of the temperament of a fanatic, he reasoned from Catholic premises that it was a king's duty to serve God first. He concluded that the greater the monarch's power, the greater his opportunity for service. It does not seem to have occurred to him that in trying to serve the omnipotent, a man might employ methods or seek particular ends not entirely to the liking of God, or that God might have other instruments and other methods more to his taste. Perhaps he overlooked the corrupting influence of a power so great that no one could safely hold it save from heights of sanctity, where there must also be suffering and desolation. In short, no one but a man who did not want it. But Philip, at 26, passionately loyal to Christ, but eager also for the delights and glories of this world, stretched out his eager hands for the shadow of his father's dream. A shadow it was, however substantial it appeared from across the Bay of Biscay and the hills of Spain. Both Philip and his father might have learned why if they had paid more attention to the Vatican and less to the politicians. Pope Julius III saw plainly enough that, so long as the church property stolen by Henry VIII remained in the hands of the new upstart nobility, it would be used by the beneficiaries to prevent any real Catholic restoration. The wolves must be deprived of their spoils. The lands of the church must be given back to her. If ever there was a favourable moment for such an attempt, it was now, when persecuted Mary was at the height of her popularity, after the heroic stand she made against Wyatt and Northumberland, when the vast majority of Englishmen, outside of London, were still Catholic at heart, and when the little group of anti-Catholic conspirators, who had mastered the boy Edward and were ready to deceive his sister at the first opportunity, were cowed in fear of their lives. The Pope's chief adviser on British affairs was Cardinal Pole, saintly and scholarly descendant of English kings and son of the noble Countess of Salisbury, who had given her head for the Catholic cause under Henry VIII, and Pole was convinced that the Catholic religion could never regain its freedom there until the church lands were restored. But the Emperor, adept at political compromises and none the wiser for the failure of his interim in Germany, was resolved not to risk another Protestant rebellion. Mary was ruled by his advice. Pole and Pope Julius III might say what they would. Charles knew better. As for Philip, he left himself entirely in his father's hands in these larger international affairs. He had some notion in the fall of 1553 of marrying Queen Mary at Brussels, in this way protecting his interests in the Netherlands and in England at the same time. The Emperor said no. In one of several long admonitions dictated to Arazo November 30th, for his hands were still crippled by gout, he advised Philip to wait in Spain until Count Egmont got the formal consent of Mary and all was settled. Meanwhile, however, he should prepare a fleet for his voyage. He would not need many troops, for England could not refuse to welcome him. He should choose the grandees who were to accompany him, and impress upon them 2 points. 1. They must practice moderation in England, living in a style they could afford to keep up, and not spend all their money immediately as they are wont to do, thus being obliged to return. And 2. They must take honest servants with them, and do all in their power to gain the goodwill of the English, who did not like strangers. And although I know it is not necessary, added the Emperor, I will ask you to be especially careful, if God favours this match, to demonstrate much love and joy to the Queen, and to do so both in public and in private. As for money, the impecunious lord of half Europe and the Indies was prepared to stake all on this great matrimonial gamble. The treasure ships from the Indies had arrived, and I am sure you have arranged to take over a good part of what belongs to the merchants, wealthy men and passengers, giving them the best possible terms. Philip was to bring with him a cool 1,000,000 in gold coin. In his absence, the government of Spain might be trusted to the Duke of Albuquerque or the Constable of Castile, only he must be sure to employ members of all the great houses to avoid letting everything get into the hands of a few. Philip gave orders, obedient son that he was, to carry out the imperial wishes, including the disregard of the Vatican's advice and the violation of the right of private property. Then he went hunting in the woods at Aranjuez. It was there that an imperial courier found him at Christmas, after seeking him first at Valladolid, with news that all had been arranged in England. He spurred immediately to Valladolid to prepare for his departure. The tidings had gone before him. The good people of the capital had decked their houses and streets with flamboyant colours in his honour, and everywhere he heard music and felicitations. In the midst of the festivities came word from Portugal that Prince John had died on the 2nd of January, leaving his young wife pregnant, and Joanna had borne a son, Sebastian, just 3 weeks later. The Spanish court changed its trappings of joy to weeds of mourning. Appropriately too, it appeared, in more than one sense, for now a second courier from Brussels brought word that the previous intelligence had been premature, and that Count Egmont would have to return to England in March to get the treaty ratified. What had happened? It was the old story. The Emperor's bête noire, France, had taken a hand in the game. Indeed, no sooner had his intentions become known than the bitter controversy between Spain and France was transferred to English soil, where it took the form of one of the most intense diplomatic duels in history between the Emperor's adroit and courtly ambassador, Reynard, and the unscrupulous and obtuse Frenchman, de Noailles. This latter spared no pains to prevent the alliance of England with his master's arch-enemy. He had already conspired with the Protestants to keep Mary Tudor from the throne. Now he plotted with them to discredit Philip and to prevent Mary from marrying him. The black legend that had begun in Protestant Germany and spread to the small but influential anti-Catholic clique in the Netherlands now assumed monstrous proportions in the propaganda of the envoy of His Most Christian Majesty. Something worse was feared at one stage. Reynard wrote the Emperor that the French were fitting out a fleet of 24 warships to keep Philip from crossing the Channel. But the Emperor's man won at last. Mary wavered a long while. She had as little love for Philip as he had for her. The oft-repeated tale of her passionate yearning for him and his cool response is unhistorical nonsense. The truth was that both were sacrificing themselves for what they believed to be the good of the Catholic faith. Mary perhaps with more simplicity and sincerity than her cousin. At the time when she was examining his portrait by Titian, sent her by the Queen of Hungary, and complaining to her council that ill-disposed persons, bent on using the proposed marriage as a pretext to attack the Catholic religion, were spreading many false, vile and untrue reports of our said cousin and others of that nation. She was earnestly searching her misgiving soul for help in her dilemma. It was after much weeping and many sleepless nights that she finally sent for Reynard and told him she wished to make a decision. She went on to say, he wrote the Emperor, that as the Blessed Sacrament was in the room, and she had always invoked it as her protector, guide and counsellor, she would on this occasion also willingly ask it to help her, and kneeling down on both knees, she recited the Veni Creator Spiritus, there being in the room only myself and Mistress Clarence, who did the same. When she arose from her knees, she said that she would marry Philip, if he would agree to all the conditions necessary for the welfare of the kingdom. These conditions reached Philip in the following April. They were as unwelcome as those the great Isabel had imposed upon Ferdinand, on which, in fact, they were based. But, after all, one had to take some chances. So Philip agreed to all the stipulations in which Gardiner, who had been in Edward's cabinet and remained in Mary's, sought to protect England from foreign domination. He agreed to respect the rights and privileges of all classes, to exclude foreigners from public offices, to make no claim upon English ships, munitions, or treasure, not to involve the country in the war between the Emperor and Henry II, but on the contrary to do all in his power to promote peace between England and France. If he and Mary had issue, their child, and not Don Carlos, would inherit the Netherlands and Burgundy, and if Mary died before her husband, he must allow this child to be brought up by English guardians. In case Philip's son, Don Carlos, died without issue, his hypothetical offspring by Mary should inherit Spain and Sicily, Milan, and all the rest of his dominions in Europe and in America. This arrangement was clearly a sacrifice of the interests of Don Carlos, but the Emperor insisted, and Philip's objections, if he made any, were overruled. That he made them is probable, for he refused, after his father's death, to consent to a similar agreement. Mary was to share all her husband's titles, honours, and dignities, these to be mentioned in all documents after their titles as King and Queen of England, and to have a jointure of £60,000 a year if she outlived her husband. This triumph of English diplomacy made the Protestant nouveau riche safe from any danger of domination by a fervent Catholic, who might force them to restore the loot of the Church. While opening up the possibility of English world dominion at the expense of Spain, it served as a counterpoise to the marriage of Mary Stuart to the French Dauphin, another threat to the Protestant party in England and to English independence. Mary of Scotland, since Elizabeth had been declared illegitimate by 2 Acts of Parliament, was the heir presumptive to the English throne. If she succeeded Mary Tudor, England would become an appanage of France, a prospect no more pleasing to Englishmen than domination by Spain. To Philip, too, the absorption of England by his chief enemy France would have been disastrous. France, possessing England, could cut off Spanish commerce in the Channel, encircle the Netherlands, and ultimately gobble them up. Mary Stuart, guided by French policy, her mother was a Guise, was made to appear an obstacle to the aspirations of Catholic Spain. The Protestant minority in England, who would soon become leaders of international Protestantism, skillfully played off against the Catholic princess and the Catholic Prince of Spain the honest nationalism of Catholic Englishmen. As soon as Philip heard that the English Council and Parliament had accepted the treaty, he sent his first gifts to Mary. They were magnificent, even for those days. There was a great table diamond, mounted as a rose in a superb gold setting, worth 50,000 ducats, a collar of 18 brilliants, worth 32,000 ducats, and another huge diamond, worth 25,000 ducats, with a fine large pearl pendant from it. There were other valuables for the Queen and for her ladies, the total worth some millions of our money. All Castile was now astir with preparations for the prince's voyage. Philip had first to meet his sister, Joanna, whom he had decided to bring back from Portugal to rule in his absence. Leaving Valladolid on May 14th, with almost 1,000 horsemen, glittering with crimson and yellow livery, burnished steel and cloth of gold, he rode to Alcantara on the Portuguese border to meet the young widow of 19 and to conduct her back to the capital. The journey back required 5 days, for the princess, mother of a 4-month-old baby, was born carefully in a litter. Philip, with characteristic thoughtfulness, stopped at Tordesillas to say goodbye, and it was his last, to his maundering old grandmother, Crazy Jane. There was some further delay while he gave detailed instructions to his sister for the conduct of his government. He might have made a worse choice. Joanna had good judgment, understood public affairs, and was sincerely Catholic. Her greatest weakness was a certain timidity. When receiving ambassadors in audience, she kept her face covered with a veil. This displeased some of the astute observers, who knew so well how to devour a face and to interpret every slight change of expression. One of them appears to have objected that he could not be sure of the identity of the person behind the veil. Thereafter, Joanna would first uncover her face and ask, "Is this the princess?" Then she would replace the veil and continue the conversation. Martyr to the convention of royalty, she left her son, Don Sebastian, in Portugal to be brought up by relatives, and spent the remainder of her life in serving the interests of Philip, to whom she was utterly devoted. Her husband's death had freed him from the necessity of depending too much on the grandees, whom his father had taught him to fear. All was ready at last. Philip left Valladolid for the north, arriving at Benavente on June 3rd, 1554. Don Carlos was waiting for him there. Next day they went together to see a bullfight. The blonde king, as he was now called, who had discarded his customary simple garb for the gay colours of a bridegroom, and the motherless boy of 9, with his slightly humped back, his great head, his legs of unequal length, his face strained by fevers and by the epilepsy that he had inherited from the emperor, the curse perhaps of so much inbreeding. An especially fine bull had been chosen for the royal sport that day, but he proved too wild even for that occasion, and held the plaza against all comers, until Don Felipe and Don Carlos had to leave by a rear door. Next day they went hunting, for how could Philip know that so many of his unborn historians would insist upon his despising the chase? Then there were jousts and juegos de canas, and after supper some extraordinary inventions, which the two princes watched from a high scaffold draped with rich cloths, amid scores of flaming torches, huge elephants made of cardboard, with men and horses inside to move them, a ship with the flags of England and Spain on it, a girl in a coffin complaining of Cupid, who came riding behind on a horse, and on reaching a point before the royal stand was lifted into the air by a rope around his waist, to set off fireworks over the heads of the people. After the conceits occurred what has been called the birth of the great Spanish drama. Lope de Rueda staged a play with comic interludes, his first recorded performance. It is tantalizing not to have a description of it, but the chroniclers were more interested in the elephants and fireworks. Cervantes, as a boy of 12, met the showman 3 or 4 years later, probably in Valladolid, and left an account of him. All of his properties were contained in a sack or costal, 4 white pelites trimmed with golden leather, and 4 beards and wigs, with 4 staffs, more or less. The plays Cervantes saw consisted of colloquies between 2 or 3 shepherds and a shepherdess, set off by 2 or 3 interludes, played by a negress, a ruffian, a fool, or that growing favourite of the infant stage, the Biscayan. Rueda used none of the tramoyas or machinery of Italian importation that astonished later audiences with manufactured thunder and lightning. His stage was as simple as Shakespeare's, the only adorno consisting of an old woolen blanket drawn by 2 cords from one side to the other, behind which was the vestuaria, or dressing room, where musicians, invisible to the audience, sang old ballads without even the accompaniment of the guitar. All the actors wore false beards. The next night, after taking an affectionate leave of Don Carlos, Philip departed for the north. At Astorga the people had prepared a fine reception for him, but, hearing that the English commissioners were already at Compostela, he went on without stopping. Arriving on the vigil of St. John, he rode directly to the shrine of Santiago. In all of Spain, with its astonishing history of crucifixion and resurrection, there was no church of which it could be better said, "Terrible and holy is this place." When Philip approached the shrine, he brushed aside the seat and cushion offered him, and knelt bareheaded on a stone floor worn by the knees of so many thousands of crusaders. After confessing his sins and receiving Holy Communion with great devotion, he prostrated himself before the mausoleum of the Apostle, patron and defender of Spain and captain of its people, to ask a blessing on his journey and his enterprise. The monks offered to take him down to the vault where the body rested. He declined out of reverence and gave orders that it should never be opened. Philip was neither a Cid Campeada nor a Saint Fernando, but he was too sincere a Spanish Catholic to have any but the purest motives in that consecrated place. To think that here lay the mortal remains of one who had seen Christ in the flesh, who had witnessed his transfiguration and his passion, who had broken bread with him after the resurrection and had seen him ascend into heaven, the greater James, one of the Boanerges. This was a thought to banish all selfishness from minds less noble than his. The tradition of St. James's preaching in Spain was almost as strong in the Spanish consciousness as that of Christianity itself. He had founded the first church in Spain at Zaragoza, where Our Lady had appeared to him in the flesh. After his martyrdom in Jerusalem, his body had been carried across the seas by other Jews, his disciples, had been forgotten during the centuries of Visigoth and Moorish invasions, until, after 700 years, it was miraculously discovered in a wood and placed in the shrine at Compostela, where numerous cures and miracles made it the resort of pilgrims from all parts of Christendom, especially after the apparition of St. James on a white horse at the Battle of Clavijo, leading the soldiers of Christ to victory against fearful odds. Philip's historian Cabrera indulges in none of the sneers with which Prescott and others of the English Protestant tradition treat the story of Santiago. To him it seems clear enough why Christianity, which no one denies appeared in Spain in the 1st century, was first preached in the peninsula by the greater James. Of the 3 favourite apostles of Christ, St. Peter, as head of the Apostolic College, had to go to the capital of the world to establish his see and his primacy. St. John, apostle of acute intelligence, eloquent, loving, should preach in Asia to people of good judgment, affable and of peaceful conversation. And St. James, as son of thunder, powerful preacher of great valour and eloquence, who with the power of his word could cause the hard stone to crumble, must make war and bring to the yoke of the gospel the warlike Spaniards, fierce and indomitable. The Church has never adopted this ingenious explanation officially, but Pope Leo XIII, in his bull Omnipotens Deus of November 1st, 1884, affirmed that the body of St. James was then in the shrine at Compostela. Absolution from a vow to make a pilgrimage to Santiago is still reserved to the Pope alone. While Philip passed along the streets of Compostela towards the shrine, some English lords were watching him very curiously from an upper window, their mantles held over their faces to prevent their discovery. They were the commissioners sent by Queen Mary to conduct him to England, but it would be a breach of etiquette to speak to the prince before he visited the shrine. Next day, however, he received them with great affability, holding his hat in his hand. On their producing the marriage contract, he signed it without more ado, having already learned its contents through diplomatic channels. The chief of Mary's commissioners was none other than John Russell, who had put down a gallant uprising of Catholics under Henry VIII, but was so adroit at explaining matters that he still remained, with a few others of his sort, in the government of Catholic Mary. It was he who founded the wealth and power of the great English house of Russell, on a goodly share of the loot of churches and monasteries. He had been canny enough to oppose Lady Jane Grey. Now, as first Earl of Bedford, he seemed to the Spanish at Santiago to be a grandee and a good Christian. They would have been surprised had they known that instead of being descended from Henry de Rossol, as obsequious genealogists were busily discovering, he was more recently sprung from certain wine merchants of Weymouth, who in turn derived from some Russells or Roussels of Gascony, possibly, like many of that name, of the stock of Spanish or Portuguese Jews. He had become a Catholic again under Mary. When the marriage with Philip was first broached, and with it the suggestion of restoring the plunder of the church to its rightful owners, he flew into a passion, tore his rosary beads from his girdle, and flung them into the fire, declaring that he valued his sweet abbey of Woburn more than any fatherly counsel from Rome. But this was a passing mood. He was not the man to oppose the inevitable. Nothing could have been more Catholic than his deportment at Compostela. He and his friends seemed delighted with the appearance and manners of Prince Philip. "O God be praised," one was heard to say piously to another, "for sending us so good a king as this." The Earl, at least, had substantial reasons for valuing his new acquaintance, for Philip gave him a solid gold statue, cunningly worked, a yard high, and containing 6,000 ducats worth of gold, the workmanship worth another 1,000. Another interesting member of the English party was Sir Thomas Gresham, a sly, plausible fellow of a family of usurers who had made himself indispensable to Henry VIII as an agent in Antwerp, where he was always able to obtain a loan when it was needed. For this Henry had knighted him. Under young Edward VI he had received, as his share of the loot of the church, lands worth perhaps $50,000 a year in our money. He had justified the confidence his employers had in him by relieving Edward's government in its final year, 1551, of a serious embarrassment. In fact, he saved the council from bankruptcy by a piece of financial chicanery often imitated by modern state financiers. On Mary's accession, he was among those notorious enemies of the Catholic Church whom the new council resolved to dismiss. There was some one at hand, however, to point out that in the wretched financial circumstances of the new government, it would be wise to employ a man so skilful in raising money, especially when he professed such an ardent desire to serve the Queen. His present mission was to take charge of the 1,000,000 ducats in gold that accompanied Philip to Spain, of which 300,000 were Mary's, borrowed on bills of exchange payable at the Spanish fairs. It was significant of what was imperceptibly coming over the world that, while the prince wore all the trappings of power and authority and received the salvos of guns and the hand-kissings of lords, it was the money-changer who took charge of the 20 carts of treasure and saw that the gold was safely stowed in the Tower of London. The sudden withdrawal of so much gold played havoc with the Spanish markets, especially in Seville, where a disastrous panic occurred after Gresham's departure. Prices rose, merchants were ruined, and the poor suffered. But Gresham gave himself no concern on that account. He had the gold. After 4 days at Santiago, Philip rode on to Corunna, where the fleet lay. His flagship was a huge merchantman, the Espiritu Santo, with high-carved and gilded poop, draped from stem to stern with fine scarlet cloth, and over her the royal standard of Spain, 30 yards long, with Philip's arms painted on its crimson damask. After a day of hunting, Philip went aboard on July 12th. On the next day, Friday the 13th, he set sail. There was a slight wind and a swell followed by a calm. On the third day there sprung up a delightful fair breeze, and the cumbersome fleet of well over 100 sail bore bravely across the bay. The following Thursday they anchored at Southampton. Philip dined and slept on board, and landed the next day.